My divorce left me broken until I found what Grandpa really left me in his old backpack. You know that feeling when you think you've got life figured out? When everything seems solid as an oak tree, roots deep in familiar ground. Yeah, well, that was me about 3 years ago. Kevin Matthews, forest ranger turned lumberjack, living what I thought was the American dream in its simplest, most honest form. My life was as predictable as sunrise over a mountain ridge. Trees, silence, the smell of pine resin clinging to my work clothes. I'd wake up at 5 a.m., coffee black as motor oil, boots laced tight, ready to head into the woods where the only politics were whether the wind was coming from the north or south. No traffic jams, no office drama, no suits telling me how to do my job. Just me, my chainsaw, and God's green earth. I was proud of that life, you know? While my buddies from high school were climbing corporate ladders and chasing stock options, I was doing real work, honest work, the kind that leaves sawdust under your fingernails and makes your back ache in a good way. I'd come home to Sarah every evening, tired but satisfied, like a man should be. But here's the thing about feeling secure. Life has a twisted sense of humor. It waits until you're most comfortable, most sure of yourself, then drops a piano on your head. Except in my case, it wasn't a piano. It was divorce papers. Sarah had been distant for months, but I figure it was just one of those phases marriages go through, like a bad winter that eventually gives way to spring. I kept telling myself we'd work it out, that 22 years of marriage meant something, that all those promises we made in that little chapel meant something. Boy, was I wrong. The divorce proceedings felt like being fed through a chipper, except the wood chipper was wearing a three-piece suit and charging $400 an hour. Sarah's lawyer, the slick city type who probably hadn't seen a real tree in his life, painted me as some kind of backwards mountain man who couldn't provide the lifestyle a modern woman deserved. And Sarah? She just sat there, nodding along like I was a stranger. Like those 22 years were nothing more than a rough draft she was finally ready to edit out of her story. The worst part wasn't losing the house, though that stung like a yellow jacket. It wasn't even losing half my savings, watching numbers disappear from my account faster than snow in July. No, the worst part was a look at her eyes. That cold, calculating stare that said I wasn't worth the fight anymore. Her mother, bless her poisonous heart, sat behind Sarah during every hearing like some kind of vulture in pearls. That woman had been working on Sarah for years, planting seeds about how she could do better, how she was wasting her life with a simple man who smelled like sawdust and couldn't tell a wine vintage from grape juice. I remember the day it all ended, standing in what used to be our living room, watching strangers car away furniture I'd saved months to buy, the leather recliner where I'd watch Sunday football, the dining table we'd hosted Thanksgiving on, even the coffee maker that had been my faithful companion for 15 years. Sarah stood in the doorway, arms crossed, supervising like I might try to steal something that was already mine, or used to be mine. The legal system has a funny way of redefining ownership when love goes south. That's when she tossed it at me, my grandfather's old backpack, landed right at my feet like a dead fish. Here, she said, her voice flat as week-old soda. This is all you need to get back to playing in the dirt like you love so much. There's no value in it anyway, just like everything else in your life. I stared down at that beat-up canvas bag, olive green, faded to the color of old moss. Torn straps held together with duct tape, zippers that stuck, pockets with mysterious stains from decades of hunting trips and camping adventures with Grandpa Joe. To her, it was junk, worthless, but to me, it was the only thing in that house that felt real anymore. The only thing that remembered who I used to be before lawyers and paperwork and cold stares redefined my existence. I picked it up, feeling the familiar weight of it in my hands. It still smelled like the woods, that deep, earthy scent of decomposing leaves and morning dew. For a second, I was 12 years old again, following Grandpa through the forest, learning which plants you could eat and which ones would kill you. Funny thing about legacy, sometimes it comes wrapped in duct tape and canvas, not gold and silver. No value, I repeated, more to myself than to her. I didn't know then that the biggest treasures often hide in the most unremarkable places, like diamonds in a coal mine, or in my case, hope in a worn-out backpack that smelled of forests and forgotten dreams. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The drive to Grandpa's old hunting cabin felt like a funeral procession where I was both the mourner and the deceased. Every pothole on that backcountry road seemed to echo another loss. The house, the marriage, the life I'd built one honest day's work at a time. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that hadn't seen maintenance since the last century. Grandpa had bought it back in the 60s, planning to use it for hunting season. Instead, it became his refuge when Grandma passed, a place where he could sit on the porch and pretend she was just inside making coffee. Now it was mine. All mine. Lucky me, the key was where he'd always kept it, under the third loose board on the porch. Some things never change, even when everything else falls apart. The door opened with a creak that sounded like arthritic bones, and I stepped into my new reality. Dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through dirty windows. Mouse droppings decorated the floor like confetti from the world's most depressing party. The air tasted stale, forgotten, like hopes left too long in storage. I dropped my duffel bag, the only other possession Sarah had let me keep, and set Grandpa's backpack on the old wooden table. It sat there like a faithful dog, waiting patiently while I figured out what came next. What came next was bourbon. A lot of bourbon. I found a bottle of wild turkey in Grandpa's pantry, probably older than some of the trees I'd been cutting. Poured myself 3 fingers in a mason jar and sat in his rocking chair, staring out at the forest that surrounded the cabin like a green fortress. This was rock bottom, I realized. 45 years old, divorced, broke, living in a cabin that hadn't seen electricity since disco was popular. My cell phone had 1 bar of signal, and even that seemed generous. But sitting there in that creaky old chair, sipping bourbon that could strip paint, something strange happened. Nobody was telling me I wasn't good enough. Nobody was explaining why my simple life was somehow inadequate. It was just me, the trees, and that backpack sitting on the table, like it was waiting for something. As the bourbon worked its magic and the sun started setting behind the ridge, I found myself thinking about Grandpa Joe. He'd been what my generation would call a character, always carrying that backpack, always scribbling in little notebooks, always talking about his land like he owned half the county. Most folks thought he was eccentric at best, crazy at worst. He'd spend weeks at a time out in these woods, mapping things, marking trees, writing in those notebooks of his. When people asked what he was doing, he'd just smile and say he was keeping track of what mattered. Grandpa always insisted there was more to this place than met the eye. Boy, he'd tell me during our camping trips, the real treasures ain't the ones everybody's fighting over. They're the ones hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone smart enough to see them. After he passed 5 years ago, I'd inherited the cabin and 40 acres of surrounding forest. Nothing special, according to the county assessor. Just rough timber land, good for hunting and not much else. The kind of property that barely covered its own taxes. But Grandpa had always insisted it was special, different, like he knew something the rest of us didn't. At the time, I figured he was talking about the peace and quiet, the beauty of nature, that sort of thing. Grandpa was always philosophical when it came to woods. Now, sitting in his chair with his backpack, staring at me from across the room, I wondered if there was more to it. The old man had been a lot of things, but he wasn't crazy. Everything he did had a purpose, even if that purpose wasn't obvious to the rest of us. The bourbon was making me sentimental, or maybe just desperate for hope. Either way, I found myself walking over to that backpack, running my fingers along its worn canvas surface. It was heavier than I remembered, not just the weight of old camping gear, but something more substantial, more purposeful. I unzipped the main compartment, expecting to find the usual camping supplies, maybe an old compass, some rusty knives, a water bottle that had seen better decades. Instead, I found something that made me pause. Notebooks, lots of them. Small leather-bound journals wrapped in plastic bags to keep the moisture out. Maps, hand-drawn and incredibly detailed. Documents in manila envelopes, yellow with age but carefully preserved. And underneath it all, something that made my heart skip a beat. Official-looking papers with county seals and legal language that I couldn't quite make out in the dying light. I picked up one of the notebooks, opened it to a random page, and saw Grandpa's careful handwriting documenting coordinates, tree types, and measurements. Not the random scribblings of an old man with too much time on his hands, but methodical, professional observations. This wasn't a hobby. This was work. Serious work. The kind of work that might explain why I'd always been so protective of this land, so insistent that it was special. The kind of work that might mean the difference between being a broken-down ex-husband with nothing to show for his life and something else entirely. I sat there as darkness crept through the trees, holding those notebooks like they might contain the secret to life itself. Since the day Sarah served me those papers, I hadn't felt anything but despair and anger. But suddenly, something else crept in. Call it curiosity. Call it desperation. Call it the bourbon talking. But suddenly, that worthless backpack didn't feel so worthless anymore. Outside, an owl hooted in the distance, and I could hear the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. The same sounds Grandpa had fallen asleep to for the last 20 years of his life, alone in this cabin with his secrets and his notebooks, and his unshakable belief that this patch of forest held something worth protecting. My heart squeezed tight when I realized the truth. Nobody had believed in me. Nobody except Grandpa Joe. And as it turned out, maybe an old beaten-up backpack that held more mysteries than I'd ever imagined. The notebooks felt warm in my hands, like they were alive, like they were waiting. Tomorrow, I'd start reading them properly. Tomorrow, I'd try to make sense of Grandpa's careful documentation and see if his faith in this land was justified. Tomorrow, I'd find out if Sarah was right about there being no value in the things that mattered to me. But tonight, for what felt like a lifetime without peace, I went to sleep with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Morning came like a gentle slap to the face. Not harsh, just firm enough to remind me I was still breathing. The cabin felt different in daylight. Less like a tomb, more like a cocoon. Maybe it was a hope from a night before, or maybe it was just a hangover making everything seem surreal. I stumbled to the kitchen, found some instant coffee that probably dated back to when gas was under $2 a gallon, and made myself a cup that could wake the dead. The first sip tasted like liquid determination mixed with regret. Outside the window, the forest was putting on its morning show. Dewdrops catching sunlight like tiny diamonds scattered across spider webs. A red cardinal landed on a windowsill, cocked its head at me like it was asking what my plan was. Good question, bird. Good question. For the first time in months, I wasn't hearing Sarah's voice in my head, picking apart every decision I made. No lawyers calling. No papers to sign. Just me, my hangover, and Grandpa's mysterious backpack sitting on the table like a patient teacher waiting for class to begin. Every morning, I felt the cold touch of dew on my face instead of the reproachful stare of my ex-wife. I was learning to listen to the forest again, distinguishing bird calls from lawyer calls. It was like rebooting my entire system, where instead of stress and arguments, there was silence and the smell of pine. And trust me, pine trees smell a hell of a lot better than court papers. The woods were teaching me something I'd forgotten during all those years of marriage and mortgages: how to just be. No performance required. No one to impress. I spent those first few days getting reacquainted with survival. Not the dramatic reality TV kind of survival, but the simple art taking care of yourself when the nearest McDonald's is 40 miles away and your cell phone is basically a very expensive paperweight. Grandpa had left the cabin stocked with the basics: canned goods that would survive a nuclear winter, fishing gear that had probably caught dinner for 3 generations of Matthews men, and a .22 rifle that still shot straighter than most politicians told the truth. I remembered his lessons like they were muscle memory. How to read the water for the best fishing spots, which berries were safe, and which ones would give you a belly ache that lasted until next Tuesday. How to move through the woods without sounding like a freight train carrying symbols. Grandpa Joe had been what you'd call a character, built like a tree stump, but moved through the forest like smoke. Always had that notebook with him, always scribbling something down with a pencil worn down to the nub. The man trusted trees more than people, and honestly, after my divorce, I was starting to see his point. He used to say the best friends were trees because they never betrayed you and always stood their ground. I'd laughed at that back then, not understanding how right he was. Trees don't file divorce papers. Trees don't take half your stuff and then act like they're doing you a favor. Grandpa always carried that notebook, writing what looked like chicken scratches to me when I was young. Who knew those chicken scratches would become my treasure map? After 3 days of living like a hermit monk who discovered bourbon, I finally worked up the courage to really dig into that backpack. Not just a quick peek like that first night, but a proper archaeological expedition. I dumped everything out on the cabin floor like I was emptying a trick-or-treat bag. What I saw made me scratch my head harder than a hound dog with fleas. There were the usual suspects: rusty knives that field dressed more dear than a butcher's shop, a compass that seemed determined to point toward my problems instead of magnetic north, and a water bottle that had seen more adventures than most people. But underneath all that regular camping gear was the real treasure. Notebooks, lots of them, each one wrapped in plastic like precious documents, which, as it turned out, they were. I opened the first one and felt like I was looking at the Rosetta Stone of rural America. Grandpa's handwriting was neat, methodical, nothing like the scrawled notes you'd expect from an old woodsman. These were professional observations, scientific even, coordinates, tree species, measurements, growth patterns, soil conditions, all documented with the precision of a surveyor and the patience of a monk copying scripture. I expected to find gold doubloons and instead found paper, lots and lots of paper. My first reaction was disappointment. So thick you could spread it on toast. But then I started actually reading those chicken scratches, and the disappointment turned into something else entirely. These weren't random observations. This was intelligence gathering. Like Grandpa had been running his own one-man forestry service for decades, mapping and cataloging every tree worth knowing about. The more I read, the more obvious it became that this wasn't some old man's hobby. This was serious business. Grandpa had been studying these woods with the dedication of a scholar and the secrecy of a spy. But studying them for what? That's when I found the maps. Hand-drawn, incredibly detailed, showing every ridge, every creek, every deer path for miles around. But here's where it got interesting. Some of the areas marked on Grandpa's maps didn't exist on any official county survey I'd ever seen. I pulled out the county maps I kept in the cabin for hunting season and spread them next to Grandpa's notebooks. It was like comparing a child's coloring book to the Sistine Chapel. The official maps showed basic topography, roads, property lines. Grandpa's maps showed the forest secrets. There were areas marked with symbols I didn't recognize, numbers that didn't correspond to any surveying system I knew, and coordinates that, according to the county, pointed at empty wilderness. But I remembered those places, vaguely. Grandpa had taken me through some of those areas when I was young, always with some excuse about checking on something or looking for the perfect camping spot. At the time, I thought he was just wandering. Now I realized every step had been purposeful. Grandpa always used to say you shouldn't trust what you see at first glance. Real secrets hide between the lines, between the trees, between the official maps. And here I was, looking at his schemes, realizing that some sections simply didn't exist on government papers. It was like discovering a secret room in an old castle that nobody had bothered to look for. I found myself remembering stories from town, whispers about certain areas in these mountains, places where the trees grew different, where hunters sometimes found things that didn't quite make sense, places that were somehow always overlooked when the big logging companies came through scouting for timber. At the time, I dismissed those stories as small-town folklore, the kind of tales that grow in the telling, until truth and fiction become indistinguishable. But looking at Grandpa's meticulous documentation, I started wondering if those old stories had more truth to them than anyone realized. The man had spent 40 years in these woods, 40 years of careful observation, detailed notes, and what I was beginning to suspect was a very specific plan. He hadn't just been mapping the forest. He'd been protecting something. But what? I picked up another notebook, this one even more carefully preserved than the others. The first page had a quote written in Grandpa's careful script. True wealth hides where others see only weeds. That was pure Grandpa Joe. The man could find philosophy in a pile of leaves and wisdom in the way water moved over rocks. But this felt different, more intentional, like he was trying to tell me something important through these pages. I kept reading, page after page of observations about specific trees. Not just any trees, old-growth hardwood, red oak, white oak, black walnut, species that took decades to mature and were worth serious money to the right buyers. But these weren't just any specimens. According to Grandpa's notes, these were giants, ancient trees hidden in areas that somehow never made it onto official forestry surveys. My hands started shaking as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just a hobby or even a passion project. This was documentation of a fortune, a green fortune that had been growing in secret for generations, protected by an old man who understood that the most valuable things are often the ones nobody else knows about. The sun was setting outside, painting the cabin walls gold through the dirty windows. I sat surrounded by notebooks and maps, feeling like a treasure hunter who just found the X that marks a spot. Except instead of gold doubloons, my treasure was growing in the ground, getting more valuable every year. I thought about all those times Grandpa had talked about this land being special, how he'd insisted it was worth more than anyone realized, how he'd fought tooth and nail to keep the big companies from buying him out, even when the offers got tempting. Everyone thought he was just a stubborn old coot who loved his trees too much to be practical. But he wasn't stubborn, he was smart. Smarter than all of us combined. Then I realized something that made my heart skip a beat. Sarah and her lawyers hadn't even known these areas existed. When they divided up the property, they'd only looked at the official county records. The 40 acres I'd inherited were just the tip of the iceberg. If Grandpa's maps were accurate and given his attention to detail, I was betting they were. There were significant stands of valuable timber out there that legally belonged to me. Timber that had never been surveyed, never been assessed, never been taxed because officially it didn't exist. I sat there as darkness settled over mountains, holding those notebooks like they contained the secret of life itself, which, in a way, they did. The secret to a different life, a better life. A life where I wasn't just Kevin Matthews, the guy who lost everything in a divorce. That's when I understood Grandpa hadn't just drawn maps. He'd left me an inheritance that could change everything. This wasn't just nostalgia anymore. This was hope. Fragile, maybe, but real as the trees growing outside my window. But there was still the question that kept nagging at me like a splinter in my thumb. Were these records accurate? Had Grandpa really found something significant? Or was this just the elaborate fantasy of an old man who'd spent too much time alone in the woods? The rational part of my brain, the part that had been beaten down by months of legal proceedings and personal failure, whispered that this was too good to be true. That desperate men see treasure maps in grocery lists. But another part of me, the part that remembered Grandpa's steady hands and sharp eyes, the part that had watched him navigate these woods like he owned them, that part said these notebooks were real. As real as the trees they documented. There was only one way to find out for sure. Tomorrow, I'd have to put down the bourbon and pick up those maps. Tomorrow, I'd have to see if an old man's chicken scratches could lead me to something worth believing in. As I closed the last notebook and prepared for bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not just hope, purpose. For the first time since Sarah had tossed me those divorce papers, I had something to do that mattered. Something to discover. Something to prove. The backpack sat empty on the table now. Its secrets spread across the cabin floor like pieces of a puzzle I was just beginning to understand. Tomorrow, I'd start putting those pieces together. And maybe, just maybe, I'd find out that being the last one chosen for Grandpa's treasure hunt was exactly where I needed to be. Dawn broke with the kind of clarity that makes a man believe in second chances. I'd made a decision during the night, somewhere between my third cup of coffee and my 100th glance at those notebooks. Today, I was going to find out if Grandpa Joe was a visionary or just a very organized dreamer. I packed the most detailed of his maps into my jacket pocket, grabbed the old compass that had somehow survived decades in that backpack, and headed into the woods like a detective investigating the world's most patient crime. The forest felt different when you're looking for something specific. Every pine needle, every fallen log, every shadow could be a clue. The first location on his list was supposed to be about 2 miles northeast of the cabin, in a hollow that didn't show up on any county survey I'd ever seen. According to his notes, this was where I'd find something he'd marked with 3 stars and the word Giants written in the margin. It took me the better part of 2 hours to find it, following deer trails and creek beds that seemed to exist in Grandpa's world, but not in mine. Then I crested a small ridge, looked down into a natural bowl surrounded by ordinary pine and maple, and saw them. Red oaks. Not just any red oaks, but monsters. Trees so old and massive they made the surrounding forest look like a nursery. I felt like an explorer stumbling into a lost temple of green pillars that had been standing since before the Civil War, maybe before the Revolution. These weren't the kind of trees you find in managed forests or lumber lots. These were living monuments that nobody wanted to acknowledge because it was inconvenient for too many people. Standing there in that hidden hollow, I understood why Grandpa had kept this place secret. Trees like these were worth more than some people's houses, but they were also irreplaceable. Cut them down, and you destroyed something that had taken centuries to create. I pulled out my measuring tape, an old habit from my forestry days, and started documenting what I was seeing. The largest oak had a circumference that would make a lumber company executive salivate and an environmentalist weep. These weren't just trees. They were living cathedrals. But here's what really got my attention. According to every official record I could think of, this hollow didn't exist. The county map showed this area as ordinary mixed hardwood forest, nothing special. But Grandpa's map showed it exactly as it was, a sanctuary of ancient oaks hidden in plain sight. Over the next week, I visited 3 more locations from his notebooks, each one exactly as documented, each one containing stands of timber that would make a logger's retirement dreams come true, each one completely absent from official surveys and tax assessments. It was like Grandpa had discovered a parallel universe where valuable trees grew in places that officially didn't exist. And somehow, through decades of careful secrecy, he'd kept it that way. But finding the trees was the easy part. Figuring out what to do with them legally was like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle while riding a roller coaster in a thunderstorm. I knew I needed help, so I drove into town to visit the county land office. That's where I met Mr. Smith, and I use the term met loosely because what actually happened felt more like an interrogation by someone who'd learned customer service from watching prison documentaries. The local clerk, this Mr. Smith character, sat behind a desk buried in papers like some old owl in its nest. When I told him about Grandpa's maps, he just snorted and said old maps were a dime a dozen around here, and it would take some updating to get them properly recognized. He was hinting at a bribe, and I looked at him thinking my grandfather would have dragged him into the woods and shown him where real values lie, not in his bureaucratic paperwork. Smith had the kind of smile that made you want to check your wallet and count your fingers afterward. He explained, with the patience of someone talking to a particularly slow child, that old family maps weren't worth the paper they were printed on unless they'd been properly surveyed and recorded. The whole conversation felt like being nickeled and dimed by a carnival barker. Every solution he offered came with a price tag that seemed designed more to line his pockets than solve my problem. Want to get your maps verified? That'll cost you. Need to file for a resurvey? More money. Want to expedite the process? Well, there were ways to make things move faster if I was willing to invest in a relationship. I sat there listening to this bureaucratic shakedown, Thinking about Grandpa spending 40 years protecting those trees, while people like Smith got rich shuffling papers and demanding tribute. That's when I realized something that hit me like a cold slap. Grandpa hadn't failed to register those lands properly. He'd kept them secret on purpose. The man had lived through the Great Depression, watched the government change rules overnight and banks foreclose on families who'd worked the same land for generations. He didn't trust the system because the system had proven it couldn't be trusted. So he created his own system, documented his own surveys, and protected his own legacy the only way he knew how, by keeping it invisible to people like Mr. Smith. I was already feeling discouraged when I remembered something. Back at the cabin, stuffed in with all those notebooks, there had been some official-looking documents I hadn't examined closely. Maybe Grandpa had been more prepared for this day than I realized. Driving back to the cabin, I felt like a man racing against time. If those trees were as valuable as I suspected, and if word got out about their existence, it wouldn't be long before bigger players than Mr. Smith started circling like vultures. I almost gave up hope when I found them among old newspapers and utility bills, tucked away like they were just another piece of forgotten mail. But there they were, deeds, original purchase agreements, survey documents. All faded, all yellow with age, but all bearing the official seals and signatures that proved Grandpa hadn't just found those trees. He'd legally owned the land they were growing on. It was like finding not just gold, but proof that you had the right to mine it. The story those documents told made perfect sense once I understood Grandpa's mindset. During the 1960s and 70s, when land was cheap and nobody cared about environmental protection, he quietly purchased several small parcels scattered throughout the mountains. Nothing big enough to attract attention, but positioned strategically to control access to the most valuable timber stands. It was brilliant, really. Instead of buying one large tract that would show up on everyone's radar, he'd assembled a network of small holdings that looked worthless individually, but controlled something priceless collectively. And since I was his only surviving heir according to his will, every one of those parcels now belonged to me. Sarah's lawyers hadn't known any of this existed. When they divided our assets, they'd only looked at what was officially recorded in my name. These parcels were still registered to Joseph Matthews, my grandfather, and they'd never been part of my marriage or my divorce. But knowing I owned something and being able to profit from it were two different problems entirely. That's when the lumber company showed up. I was sitting on the cabin porch, trying to make sense of property boundaries and survey markers, when a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up my dirt road like it owned the place. Two men in expensive suits climbed out, looking about as comfortable in the woods as fish in a desert. The older one introduced himself as a representative of Cascade Timber, one of the biggest logging operations in the region. Somehow, word had gotten out that there might be some interesting timber on my property. They were prepared to make me an offer. The figure they mentioned was insulting, not just low, but so deliberately low it felt like a slap in the face. They called it undeveloped woodland with limited commercial potential. They made it sound like they were doing me a favor by offering to haul away my worthless trees. I looked at their smooth faces and thought about how they couldn't see the forest for the dollar signs. They couldn't see heritage behind the numbers. They saw board feet and profit margins where I saw centuries of growth in Grandpa's legacy. I turned them down flat. It felt like spitting in their faces with their own money. I didn't have a dime to my name, but I felt something new awakening in me. This wasn't about revenge against my ex-wife anymore. This was a battle for justice, for Grandpa's memory, for the land that had been waiting for me. That moment changed everything. I wasn't just Kevin Matthews, the guy who'd lost everything in a divorce. I was Kevin Matthews, guardian of a legacy that had been growing in secret for decades. That's when I knew I needed a real lawyer, not some small-town attorney who handled wills and traffic tickets, but someone who understood both environmental law and property rights. Someone who could navigate the bureaucratic maze without getting lost or bought off. I called around and got referred to Patricia Chun, an attorney 2 counties over who specialized in exactly these kind of cases. When I explained my situation over the phone, there was a long pause before she said something that gave me hope for the first time in weeks. She said she'd seen cases like mine before. Families who'd held on to land for generations, only to discover they were sitting on resources they'd never imagined. The trick was proving ownership and establishing value without alerting every timber company and developer in 3 states. Her fee was steep, more money than I'd ever spent on anything except my wedding and my divorce. But she offered something Mr. Smith and the Cascade timber representatives hadn't: honesty. She told me straight up that this would be a fight, that people with deep pockets would try to separate me from my inheritance, and that nothing was guaranteed. As Mark Twain once said, the best way to lift yourself up is to lift someone else up, but sometimes, to lift yourself up, you first have to lift the barbell of bureaucracy. Sitting in her office, surrounded by law books and case files, I felt something I hadn't experienced since finding those notebooks. Not just hope, but determination. The kind of stubborn, dig-in-your-heels determination that runs in the Matthews family DNA. Patricia explained that we had 2 major challenges ahead of us. First, we needed to establish clear title to all of Grandpa's scatter parcels and get them properly surveyed and recorded. Second, we needed to do it quietly, before word got out and bigger players move in to complicate things. She estimated the process would take months, maybe longer. There would be court filings, bureaucratic battles, and probably attempts at intimidation from people who preferred the old system where valuable resources stayed hidden and undervalued. In that moment, I felt something new awakening inside me. This was no longer about revenge. This was justice. Justice that was worth every cent and every nerve cell. I was no longer just a broken-down ex-husband with nothing to show for his life. I was the chosen guardian of something my grandfather had protected his entire adult life. Walking out of that law office, I understood that the real battle was just beginning. The trees were there, the legal right was there, but the fight to claim what was rightfully mine would test everything I thought I knew about myself. The easy money from Cascade Timber was off the table. The comfortable lie that my inheritance was worthless was shattered. Now came the hard part, proving that sometimes the most valuable things are the ones that everyone else overlooks. But as I drove back toward the mountains, toward Grandpa's cabin and his hidden cathedral of ancient oaks, I felt ready for whatever came next. Because some fights are worth having, even when you're not sure you can win them. Especially when you're not sure you can win them. The real work was about to begin. The real work began the moment I walked out of Patricia Chen's law office. What I thought would be a straightforward process of proving ownership turned into a bureaucratic marathon that would have broken lesser men, or at least men without a grandfather's legacy burning in their chests like rocket fuel. The paperwork multiplied faster than rabbits in spring. Every clerk seemed to find a new reason for rejection, like it was their favorite game show and the prize was my sanity. Filing fees, survey costs, documentation requirements. Each step came with a price tag that made my wallet weep. I had to get creative about funding this legal battle. Real creative. I took a job at the local hardware store, stacking lumber and mixing paint for folks who used to nod politely when they saw me around town. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, sitting on a forest worth more than most people's retirement accounts, selling 2x4s for $10 an hour. I sold everything that wasn't nailed down. The old television that had kept me company through too many lonely evenings. My fishing gear, including the rod Grandpa had given me for my 16th birthday. Even Grandma's china set, the one that had never seen a proper dinner party, but had lived in our cabinet like a shrine to better times. It was like walking on hot coals, but every step brought me closer to the goal. Every sacrifice felt like an investment in something bigger than myself. Patricia kept me updated on our progress, which moved at the speed of glacial ice with a government stamp on it. But while the lawyers did their paper shuffling, I was getting an education in a business I never knew existed. The specialty timber market turned out to be like a secret society with its own language, customs, and unwritten rules. I was a lumberjack, not a businessman, but the forest had taught me patience, and now it was teaching me something else entirely. I started studying the rare hardwood market, like an old bear learning new territory. Every tree Grandpa had marked in those notebooks was like a precious coin waiting to be discovered. I learned to distinguish the subtle differences in wood grain, to recognize the signs of age and quality that separated valuable timber from ordinary logs. And believe me, it was a lot more interesting than listening to lawyers drone on about divorce settlements. The breakthrough came 6 months later, when Patricia finally got the first parcel officially recorded in my name. It was just 40 acres of what looked like ordinary woodland, but I knew better. Hidden in that 40 acres were 12 ancient red oaks that a specialty furniture maker in North Carolina had been looking for. I connected with him through a woodworking forum online. One of those places where craftsmen gather to share photos of their latest projects and complain about the quality of modern lumber. When I posted pictures of Grandpa's trees, my inbox exploded. The first sale was like winning the lottery while being struck by lightning during a solar eclipse. I thought it had to be a mistake when I saw the numbers on the check. The amount was enough to buy a new truck instead of just paying another lawyer's bill. This wasn't just money. This was a ticket to a different life. This was proof that Grandpa hadn't been an eccentric old man with too much time on his hands. He'd been a visionary. That check changed everything. Not just financially, but mentally. For the first time since Sarah had walked out, I felt like I was worth something again. Like I had value beyond what some divorce attorney could calculate on a spreadsheet. I made a decision that probably seemed crazy to anyone looking from the outside. Instead of selling everything at once and living like a king for a few years, I was going to build something sustainable. Something that would honor what Grandpa had protected all those years. I bought modest equipment, a small sawmill, a used truck that didn't leak oil on my driveway, basic tools for selective harvesting. I hired 2 local guys who'd been out of work since the last big logging company pulled out of the area. Tommy and Jake were good men who understood that you don't clear-cut a cathedral. Word spread fast in small towns. Kevin Matthews, the guy who lost everything in his divorce, was suddenly the guy with the secret forest. People started looking at me differently, not with pity anymore, but with curiosity and maybe a little respect. About that time, the rumors started reaching me about Sarah and her new life. Small towns are like that. Information travels faster than wildfire and usually with about as much accuracy. But this time, the gossip mill was grinding out some pretty entertaining stories. Turned out her ambitious new partner, the one who was supposed to rescue her from life with a simple woodsman, had some issues with honesty, the kind of issues that involved the IRS, several angry investors, and what the newspapers politely called alleged financial irregularities. The rumors about my ex-wife reached me faster than a forest fire. Her successful new partner turned out to be a con man, and she found herself in the center of a scandal. They wanted to take my life away from me, but ended up losing their own instead. I didn't feel anger, just a slight smile, because as Benjamin Franklin said, experience is the best teacher, but the tuition is high, and it seemed like they'd paid full price. I wasn't angry about it. Honestly, I wasn't anything about it except maybe slightly amused. Justice has a way of working itself out, usually when you're too busy building something new to worry about tearing down something old. The business grew organically, the way good things do when you're not forcing them. I developed relationships with craftsmen who appreciated quality over quantity, people who understood that some trees are worth more standing than fallen. My reputation spread through networks I didn't even know existed. Within 2 years, I wasn't just Kevin Matthews with the Secret Force anymore. I was Kevin Matthews of Red Oak Legacy Incorporated, a specialty timber company that sourced rare hardwoods for high-end furniture makers, musical instrument builders, and restoration projects. The company became more than just a business. It became a symbol. We proved that forests aren't just sources of lumber, but living inheritances that deserve respect. I, a simple lumberjack, was now conducting meetings with investors and signing million-dollar contracts. Who would have thought that an old backpack would become my ticket to the world of big money and even bigger responsibilities? I built a proper office in town. Nothing fancy, but professional enough to impress the kind of clients who paid premium prices for premium wood. The walls were lined with samples of our finest pieces, cross-sections of ancient oaks that showed growth rings spanning centuries. But the centerpiece of that office was something special, something that reminded me every day where this all started. One afternoon, as I was arranging the new space, I went back to the cabin and retrieved 2 items that meant more to me than all the contracts and bank statements combined. Grandpa's old backpack, still smelling faintly of forest and hope, and his axe, the one he'd used to mark trees, clear trails, and teach a young boy that honest work was its own reward. I placed them in a custom glass display case right in the center of the main office, not as museum pieces, but as reminders that true wealth isn't what you accumulate, but what you create, or in my case, what you discover when others see only junk. Standing there in my new office, looking at the photograph of Grandpa I'd mounted on the wall behind my desk, his wise eyes watching over everything I built, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete satisfaction. That's when my secretary knocked and delivered news that made this whole story feel like it had come full circle. Sarah wanted to see me. She was waiting in the lobby. I smiled and told my secretary to send her in. She walked into my office that breathed success and smelled of the sawdust she'd once called dirt. She looked lost, almost broken. She asked for help for a job. Her voice trembled, and her eyes were full of despair. She looked around the office with its rich wood paneling, at the display case with the backpack she'd once thrown at my feet, at the success she'd never imagined possible. I could see her trying to reconcile this reality with the failed lumberjack she'd divorced. When she spoke, her voice had lost all the confidence and contempt I remembered. She talked about needing a fresh start, about the mistakes she'd made, about hoping I might find a place for her in what I'd built. I listened politely, remembering the woman I'd once loved, seeing the person she'd become. When she finished talking, I leaned back in my chair and thought about Grandpa's lessons on forgiveness and second chances. Then I remembered her words about values and told her she needed a different forest. My forest was my legacy, and it wasn't for sale at any price. Neither was my dignity. She left quietly, and I watched from my window as she got into a car that had seen better days. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, no vindication in her troubles, just a quiet certainty that some chapters in life need to end cleanly before new ones can begin. The display case caught the afternoon sunlight, making the old backpack glow, like it was lit from within. Those weren't just objects in there. They were symbols of perseverance, of faith, of the belief that real treasures hide where others see only worthless junk. These days, I do something that brings me more joy than any business deal ever could. I take groups of local school kids through the forest Grandpa protected, showing them the notebooks and maps, explaining the philosophy of true wealth. I tell them to remember that the biggest treasures often hide where others see only trash, in old things, in forgotten corners, in the hearts of people who believe in you. Or as Grandpa would have said, real wisdom is seeing the forest for the trees, and wealth behind the paperwork. And believe me, there are still plenty of undiscovered treasures in these woods, for anyone willing to look. Standing in that forest with those kids, watching their eyes light up when they understand that value isn't always obvious, I feel something that goes beyond success or revenge or even justice. I feel complete. This wasn't just victory. This was triumph. Triumph of spirit, faith, and legacy. And I knew Grandpa would be proud. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the glass case and see him looking back at me. The same stubborn chin, the same hands that know the feel of honest work, the same eyes that can see treasure where others see trash. The forest is still full of secrets. Grandpa's notebooks still have pages I haven't fully explored. And somewhere out there, maybe there's another broken down man with an old backpack, wondering if his grandfather was crazy or just ahead of his time. If your heart is beating faster right now, you understand. This isn't just a story. This is truth. If you believe in second chances and that real value hides where others don't look, you get it. This is how the American dream comes alive when you stop looking on the surface and start digging deeper. The backpack sits in its place of honor, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable inheritances come wrapped in canvas and duct tape, not gold and silver. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who never got to see their students graduate. And sometimes, being the last one chosen for the treasure hunt is exactly where you need to be. The real treasure was never in the trees. It was in the lesson. The lesson that worth isn't determined by what others think you're worth, but by what you're willing to fight for. And that, my friends, is a lesson worth more than all the ancient oaks and all the hidden hollows in all the mountains of America.